Okay.
Good?
It's on.
All right, thank you. So welcome to this morning's meeting of the New York Technology Council. Delighted to have you here, and welcome to everyone who will be watching this on our YouTube channel once we get this up there. This morning we're having a forum on federal technology policy. As many of you know, tech is, I won't say late to the party, because a lot of tech hasn't gotten to the party yet in terms of technology, in terms of policy and realizing how important it is. We're trying to help that. Policy has an enormous impact on businesses, and tech is just figuring that out. One of the problems is probably tech moves so quickly that, and is often focused on the very short term, that anything that would take as long as a change in policy seems like it's just not worth working on. So we're trying to fix that. So I'll introduce the panel in a minute. I'll introduce Liz and she'll introduce the rest of the panel. Let me say a quick bit about us. We're a nonprofit. We focus on 5 areas. We do education, which is not classroom style. It's panel discussions and speakers like this. Networking. We usually have food over which we network. That'll, of course, happen shortly. And then we do a couple of big networking parties every year. July 22nd this year, we're having a large event. Hope to see you there. We're with lots of organizations in the community. Other parts of the country, tech councils are the only game in town in tech. Hardly the case in New York. There are dozens, probably 100 organizations. We work with many of them, co-produce events, and help each other out all the time. We work in workforce development. We play the role of working with the organizations that are doing the training, helping them with curriculum, providing mentors and speakers, and then helping find internships and eventually jobs for those who get trained. And then advocacy. We're active in advocating. At the federal level, we work with TechVoice actively and with other tech councils. And at the local level, trying to tell the new administration what we think ought to be done. And starting to have some effect there when de Blasio gave his keynote Internet Week. He mentioned me and Tech Council by name and said he was going to be following our recommendations. So we're happy that we're being listened to on that front. We're a membership organization. If those of you aren't members, hope you consider joining. I want to thank our annual sponsors. There's our principal source of revenue, pays the bills. So thanks to all of them. We wouldn't be here without them. As I mentioned, we have lots of partnerships. I'm certainly not going to go through all of these. And special thanks to Anchin for providing the room. Chris Noble was marketing director here at Anchin. Chris, you want to say a few things? Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Noble from Anchin. I'm a director here. Just want to give a quick overview of what Anchin is. We are a 350-person accounting firm. We do consulting and accounting for all different industries in New York. I specialize in the technology group, and we are happy to once again host New York Tech, and I look forward to meeting everyone.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks again for the space. So this is a joint presentation between New York Technology Council and TechVoice, although it's morphing into TechAmerica. And let me introduce Liz Hyman, who will then introduce the rest of the panel. And want to thank her for helping organize this.
Thanks, Eric, and good morning, everybody. Liz Hyman, Executive Vice President of Public Advocacy at CompTIA, and TechAmerica, which is our brand for our definitely things that happen over the long run, and it takes some investment of time and effort, as we'll learn this morning. But nonetheless, they're important debates to be engaged in, and that was really the purpose and design of TechVoice, and now our continuing efforts in partnership with New York Tech Council and many technology councils around the country. So very pleased to be here. Very pleased to kick off this conversation looking at federal technology policy. I think I'm going to introduce our panel in just one second, but just to conclude to say that there's a recurring theme here in this conversation, and it's really about activity that's happening outside of Washington, D.C. because sometimes Congress moves a little more slowly than we would like, and I think that would be an understatement to many of us at the table. Sometimes it is something that takes a concerted effort over a period of time to achieve some of our objectives. And the pressure that happens out of the states and within the localities is the thing that eventually leads to action in Washington. So that's the sort of long-term investment that I think we're going to talk about. We're going to cover 3 important issues that are currently in front of the national debate. High-skilled immigration reform, what's happening with patent litigation reform, and what's happening with cybersecurity and our efforts to secure our critical infrastructure. So these are 3 critical areas. We have a great panel that I want to introduce. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly go through the list. Then I'm going to ask each of them to just give a quick introduction about who they are and what they do. And then we'll get into some Q&A. And then following that, I'll open it up to questions from you all. So at the end of the table here, we have Jake Ward. He is the Executive Director of the Application Developers Alliance, or the APPS Alliance, it's commonly referred to. And we'll be able to talk in quite some detail about what's going on with the patent litigation reform effort. Then we have Dan Wallace, who's a strategic advisor for the Partnership for a New American Economy. And they've been extraordinarily active in the immigration debate and really providing, I think, a great baseline of objective data and analysis about what immigration reform means for our economy. So we're thrilled to have him. And then obviously Chris Duvall, who joins us from the Department of Homeland Security in the Office of Cybersecurity and Communication. Yep, can't read my own writing. Yeah. So, and has been now going around the country talking about a cybersecurity framework that has been unveiled by the federal government to encourage voluntary compliance with some of these best practices to secure our critical infrastructure. So great panel. Jake, why don't you kick it off with a quick overview of...
Sure. Thanks, Liz. I'm Jake Ward, and I'm a co-founder and executive director of the Application Developers Alliance. We're a global membership organization that represents developers to be able to build the things on your phone as well as on websites, enterprise apps, and the companies that care about them. We launched 2.5 years ago, January 2012. Represent nearly 200 companies around the world and 40,000 individual developers. We provide a lot of sort of business side resources and services, particularly early stage startups and entrepreneurs, as well as support for enterprise and analysis for the big companies, industry analysis. And then we are, as we like to say, the voice of the industry, the advocates for developers in Washington on the state level. And now, as we opened up our European offices at a more global level. And we, as Liz mentioned, we've been embroiled in the patent fight for the last 2 years, because more often than not, it is my members that are being put out of business by patent trolls. Google and Samsung, also members, are able to take pounds of flesh off each other, but also to defend themselves against patent trolls much more effectively than a 4-person startup that receives a demand letter, or even a 100-person 5-year-old company that doesn't have a general counsel. And so that's been a big piece of what we've done on the advocacy side in the past 20 months, 18 months. Feels like a lifetime.
So I work for the Partnership for a New American Economy. We were founded in 2010 by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, Rupert Murdoch, and other CEOs and mayors around the country. So we're a bipartisan coalition. Since then, we've grown to more than 500 mayors and CEOs. The idea for founding this organization was sort of the immigration debate, which has been, at this point, it's been almost 3 decades since the last time we did anything with our immigration system, significant anyway. Has been focused mostly on sort of the human rights perspective, family reunification, a lot of things that are very important, but also hadn't done a great job in terms of making those arguments and moving the needle with Republicans in the Senate and in the House. And so the aim of this organization is to provide data on the economic benefits of immigration and to really provide a political sort of political room for Republicans to feel like they can, get behind the issue and take a stand. And so, given where the debate is now in Congress, Republicans are really the only remaining, voice that we need to get it over the finish line. And so our coalition is now focused more on the center right. We recently hosted a call with Rupert Norquist, and the co-founder of the Tea Party Express, who announced his support for immigration reform. So doing things like that to sort of highlight conservative voices that also support reform. And our first report that we released, which is I think the most frequently cited, showed that 40% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by either an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. So that includes Google, IBM, Intel, a lot of huge firms that were founded or co-founded by immigrants. And so those kinds of, I think, statistics and that kind of information helps move the debate on both sides of the aisle.
Chris Duvall, the Office of Cybersecurity and Communication, as Liz said, Department of Homeland Security. I wear a couple different hats, but I think in terms of this audience, the most important one is, for those of you who hopefully have heard about the Executive Order 13636, Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. There was a stand-up of a program called a voluntary program that looked at helping organizations think about using the framework that was cited in improving their sort of cybersecurity posture. So we try to, we get a little jaded inside the Beltway, so we try to go out and talk to the actual individual organizations and associations about cybersecurity and about the framework and about the program, because we find that there's a number of resources that are free resources the government has developed and provided that folks haven't even heard of. So any and all ways that we can get the message out, we try to do that. I've been with the department one way or other since 2004, so it's almost since the stand-up. And cybersecurity continues to be one of those areas that it's hard to define what is cybersecurity, but they're very constantly changing. So there's a number of different aspects that our office and my colleagues sort of work on in terms of cybersecurity. So I'm looking forward to having that chat today.
Great. So I guess, Chris, I'll kick it off with you, because you're right next to me. So could you go into a little bit more detail about what the objectives were of the framework? I know CompTIA, we represent about 2,000 member companies, and we were anxious to get some comments into a very open process. There were a number of workshops, I believe, that led to the creation of the framework. But thinking about companies that may not actually own the critical infrastructure, but are somehow related to it, what does it do? What does it mean?
Sure. So we'll take a step back in time just a little bit, and you mentioned Congress. So there were a number of different pieces of legislation over the last few years that looked at were there ways to regulate sort of cybersecurity and improve, sort of raise the bar for the nation in terms of what individuals and companies and organizations were doing in terms of their sort of information assurance and security. All of those pieces of legislation sort of met resistance one way or another and never really worked out. So the Obama administration said, well, let's maybe take this back and we'll develop an executive order that talks about not regulating cybersecurity, but developing a voluntary program, a voluntary way that we can share information, both public sector and private sector, that organizations can look at cybersecurity and that can sort of talk about the most critical, but also those that just sort of are playing in the critical infrastructure space, whether they own and operate that infrastructure or perhaps they're part of their supply chain. So as part of the executive order, the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, was tasked to develop kind of a framework, which is a set of best practices, tools, methodologies, and processes that any organization, large, small, domestic, international, that could sort of look at and say, okay, here's what we're doing, and here's what we, NIST, or the US government kind of recommend or suggest you might look at in terms of different areas, whether it's access control or identity management or some of these other sort of domain areas. And so building on a number of different standards that were already sort of out there and trying to kind of simplify them and explain them so that your average person, I don't know if anyone's ever read 853, but I don't recommend it at all. So the framework is much easier sort of document to go through and compare, between your CIO, CISO, or network administrator, whoever you might have as part of your organization, look at the different aspects that sort of are the foundational, and then there's different tiers of that. So long story short, so the executive order came out and said, here's this framework, and then we have to have a mechanism to encourage folks to understand it, which is what our program does. It's the Critical Infrastructure Cyber Community, or C-Cubed program. But it's sort of, we're just trying to help, here's what the framework is, here how it might be applicable to your organization. We're happy to talk to you about ways, there's various tools that you can use, including one that DHS provides, the Cyber Resilience Group, that actually is online, and you can go through and kind of radio button what your organization is doing, and it will sort of say, hey, you're doing great in these areas, and here's some other areas you might look at, and here's some tools and resources that are free from either DHS or NSA or some of these other organizations that might help you sort of bridge some of these gaps that have been identified. So we, myself and my colleagues in the small office, we try to get outside the Beltway to explain that. We just had a large event in Boston. We've lost a little bit of the sort of the shock and awe when we go to a larger audience and say, you know, who here have heard of the executive order, and maybe 50 hands go up, and that's like, man, so much work to be done. So we're still trying to get the word out in terms of what critical infrastructures, but also those maybe small and medium-sized businesses that are part of the supply chain, or that may not have the most critical infrastructure, but still are part of in that space and are sort of providing important and vital sort of goods and services to the nation. So are there things that can be done in their systems and networks that will just sort of raise all boats?
And just one follow-on question before I move on. So in terms of, you know, the small and medium-sized IT firm that may be in the supply chain, that has some tangential importance to the critical infrastructure, it's still a 41-page document, right? Do you have to comply with everything? And are there maybe some incentives or opportunities to help some of the smaller companies understand why this is important and what they can do to voluntarily comply?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and I wrote it down here because as you were introducing it. So obviously inside DC, we're very cognizant of how things are phrased. So when you said even voluntary compliance, I sort of winced because there's no compliance. There is only use and sort of, and so that was a large discussion we had early on. But so one of the key things is that it's all voluntary. You can't. Our argument is if you require something to be done, then does that create a false sort of bottom? So it's a process of sort of working with organizations to have them see the importance, and the importance being that maybe you're a large organization, you have teams of IT specialists that are out there sort of checking your network. But are you working closely with your partners or those within your supply chain that may not have that large shop to make sure that there isn't a vulnerability sort of downstream? So the importance is not only in terms of market share, or the big guys here, but also are the small and medium sized that are providing goods and services and are supporting the critical infrastructure. Are they also secure? Because we're only as strong as the weakest link, so that's where it's important.
We'll come back to it, but Dan, I'm going to skip to immigration reform right now. Politico this morning has a big headline, the story of the death of immigration reform. Media tends to overstate things one way or the other, but this certainly has been a long slog. So I'm just curious, as we think about immigration reform, we talk about high-skilled immigration. What are some of the specific pieces of it that are so meaningful? Because sometimes we hear, hey, I really don't want to be giving my job away to somebody who's not a Native American. How does this actually benefit the tech sector?
Right, so that's a good question. I think this is one of the issues that we've actually seen the most progress with Republicans on in Congress in terms of understanding the importance of high-skilled immigration. The question of competing with U.S.-born workers, we actually just released a report a couple of weeks ago on the H-1B visa issue. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, in 1990 was the most recent iteration of the H-1B high-skilled visa. It's capped at $65,000 per year, plus an additional $20,000 for STEM grads. And so that's a pretty small number. It's been that same number. It went up a little bit in the past couple of years, but now it's still the same cap that it was when it started in 1990. So think about 1990, where the tech sector was, and think about where it is today. And the fact that that number is still the same, it hasn't changed, just doesn't reflect the reality of our economy. And so the problem that creates is that you have a lot of companies that are having trouble hiring workers. And so in 2013, just 4 companies, it was Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, maybe Intel, I'm forgetting one, had 10,000 open positions between them. Microsoft recently announced that it's moving, or it's going to open a new office in Vancouver. Canada, it's much easier to get a visa, and so that company, or that office, will create 400 jobs by 2015. So that's a clear example of how a company that's can't find the workers that it needs here, it's going to move abroad if they can't do that. And so to that issue, what happens is that when the H-1B visa lottery opens in April, in the past couple of years, the supply, the total number, the cap has been hit within a week. And when that happens, they create a lottery. And so everyone who's applying for visas, it just goes into this randomized lottery. It's not necessarily based on the quality of their application. It's just it's totally randomized. And so that happened in the past couple of years. It also happened in 2007, 2008. And so what we looked at, we had an economist from UC Davis, Giovanni Perry, look at what happened as a result of visa denials from those lotteries. So I think it was close to 180,000 visas that didn't make it through that process in the 2007 and 2008 visa lotteries. And the result was that those jobs that were being applied for actually weren't filled. So if there had been US-born workers who met those criteria, the firms would have hired them, but instead those jobs were unfilled, and actually tech firms in metro areas across the country missed out on creating an additional 230,000 jobs for US-born workers. In New York, actually, I have the statistics, because of the visas denied here, which over the 2 years, it was an average of 17,000 visas per year. We lost 6,655, as many jobs for US-born college-educated tech workers, and as many as 21,000 for folks in the tech sector without a college degree. So it's both high-skilled and even folks without a bachelor's degree. So the fact that the companies weren't able to hire workers meant that they weren't able to grow. It slowed the growth of our tech sector. It slowed wage growth for US-born workers as well. So everyone is impacted by this. And I think that what this study speaks to is that it's not that we're hiring foreign workers instead of US-born workers. It's that foreign workers are actually complementary to US-born workers. And when companies can't find the talent that they need, they're not able to grow as quickly and hire everyone that works here. So that's a huge issue. We have thousands of STEM grads graduating every year who have come here from other countries, who are working, who we've educated here in the US, who don't have a clear path to stay. They have to go through that visa lottery as well. I was speaking with someone the other day who had a job offer from a major tech firm in Silicon Valley, had already created 2 apps, was working on his 3rd app, and he's just waiting to see if his visa gets through the lottery. So that's not the kind of thing that we need to be doing, and I think that it clearly speaks to the point that this is an issue that everyone should care about, especially in the tech sector.
So just to comment from the peanut gallery, so just from our sort of outreach and awareness events, that's probably one of the most frequently cited concerns is, we've looked at the framework, or we've looked at cybersecurity, and we want to do it, we just don't have the right qualified people to be able to do this.
So that's a real ripple effect in terms of not only, the intellectual property that's being created, but how we secure the intellectual property. So that's quite a linkage there. You also mentioned that, and just referred to it, that there is a report that you all did that was specific to New York that might be available to the audience here.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you want to find the report, I can send it to you after and to send it around, but it's at, our website is renewoureconomy.org, and then we have a tab for research and reports, and it's the most recent one. It's called Closing Economic Windows. It was written by Giovanni Perry.
Great. And the other thing I was just going to ask you is, obviously, this has been in the news lately, with Leader Cantor's defeat just a couple weeks ago. There was a lot of sort of post-mortem, Monday morning quarterbacking that immigration reform and his support for that was probably one of the great contributors to his loss. You could debate that, frankly,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, that's the perception. So here we are. You mentioned that you've been doing work with Grover Norquist and others. What's the play to actually try to get the Republican House on board? Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's really challenging. I think one of the most frustrating things is that we talk to a lot of folks who are already there on the issue, and it's a matter of feeling like they have the political room to announce their support for it. And so a number of things that we try to do to show that that wasn't the case, not with Cantor, but with Renee Elmers. She's a Republican congresswoman in North Carolina. She had a Tea Party challenger from the right in her primary. Immigration became a huge issue in her race. She stayed firm on immigration, on her support for it, and we polled voters in her district, Republican voters, and found that it didn't change their view of her. They voted for her, just as if she had, said whether she supported immigration reform or not. Many of them actually supported immigration reform themselves. We did another poll of folks who identify as Tea Party voters. 70% of them say that they want comprehensive immigration reform, not just border security. So I think that, across the country, the votes are there. You have this issue with Cantor. Now, honestly, I don't think that Cantor was actually, I think he was an obstacle to getting this passed. And so it's amazing how this sort of has spun out of his race. But we are still working very closely with the U.S. Chamber. Some of you may be familiar with Ford.us, which was founded by Mark Zuckerberg. A lot of these groups are still mobilizing to get something done this summer. I think, if any time is the best window, after the primaries are over, before the election. The Obama administration, was considering doing something administrative. They've delayed that decision. I think there's still room. The new Majority Leader McCarthy comes from a district that has a very diverse population. I think he'll feel pressure there as well. And so I think, our strategy has been obviously doing a lot of direct lobbying in DC, but also we have a field organization, not grassroots, but sort of grass tops conservative leaders who are in some of these key districts around the country. And so to the extent that there are companies in their districts, tech companies, other types of companies, CEOs, business leaders, conservative leaders that we are able to sort of bring to the table. That's what we're working to do over the next few weeks, just to make sure that this stays on the agenda. Whether or not that happens, I think it was going to be a hard year either way, and this has certainly made it more difficult. But we're still going. So.
It's a hard year for everything.
Well, like I said at the beginning, this is, when you talk about federal policy, it's often for the long game, right? And so even though it may be frustrating in the immediate term, keeping that dialogue going and trying to continue the drumbeat is the payoffs down the road, we hope. So, and speaking of payoffs down the road, so another major debate that's unfolding in Washington, but probably more significantly around the country, has to do with patent litigation reform. And I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about what the current state of play is and why that's relevant to our audience.
I'm sure I could talk about it. I'm not sure I'm going to say anything intelligent. Software patents are a hot button issue basically on the corners of the country where a lot of software is being built. There are many very, very smart people who think that software patents generally are stupid. That you shouldn't be able to patent an idea, which is ostensibly what software does. You can copyright the code, and that could get interesting, but that patenting software is just dumb. There are people who are a little less zealous about that, who say the current patent system, the 17-year monopoly, isn't in keeping with today's pace. The technology moves so much quicker than that the business cycles move so much quicker than that. And it brings up the issue around patent quality, which is one of the three legs of the stool of the broken patent system. The second piece is sort of pre-litigation, right? Nobody really denies people's ability to own intellectual property and to profit on it and to build businesses out of it. Where there is debate and where legislation is ultimately coming to the fore is the question around patent trolls, non-practicing entities that buy patents and then try to license them through various methods, including extortion, from companies claiming that they've infringed on that patent. As I mentioned, the issue of quality comes in because those patents can be pretty broad. I'll give an example in a second. They can be overreaching, and the methods that are used to secure licensing can border on extortion. There is a patent right now that is being used by Wallace, one of the largest trolls in the country, to I think they put out something like 1,100 claim letters in the last 16, 18 months. It's a patent for a fax machine service where you can use the keypad to say, yes, this has been a good product, or no, it's not a good product. That patent is 15 years old, 16 years old, and is being used to claim that in-app purchasing is a violation of that patent, because you use a button on your phone to validate your desire to do something through a connected network device. And Wallace is using that to sue Disney, Backflip Studios, Rovio, 10 of my members. Anyway, you get the idea. So litigation was introduced in the House early last year that attempts to address some components of patent quality to add transparency to what are called demand letters, which is the first step in patent troll fee negotiation, where you get a letter in the mail that says, we think that you violated patent, sometimes it says the patent number, not always. We'd like to talk to you about licensing this exciting new technology. You violated one of these claims, and it can go on for pages and pages and pages. And this is a really nice one. And then at the end it says, we'd be happy to talk to you soon about this. Here are our terms. And it could be anything from 3% of revenue in perpetuity or $1,000 a month, or anyway, they'll set baseline terms. The nastier demand letters are, you're violating our patents to avoid protracted, costly litigation where you need $1,000 a month starting next month. Here's what you violated, and that's 25 pages of claims. So that's a demand letter issue. And then, I won't get into the nuts and bolts of it, but there's litigation pieces too. How long discovery can go on for, who pays the bills if there's a lawsuit that's brought for no particular reason. Because patent trolls don't pay any money other than they just own the patent. It didn't cost anything because they didn't file it in the first place. They just bought it and paid annual licensing fee. So they can run up bills of millions of dollars for firms through discovery costs and legal costs. And if they lose, they go, oh, all right, I just move on. And if you win that case as a company, you just have the right now to continue doing what you were doing before, $2 million lighter. And so that bill passed in the House, got stuck in Judiciary in the Senate, but we are this close to seeing real progress. We think 2015 will be the year that this gets passed, that there will be meaningful, at least pre-litigation and litigation reform, demand letters, bifurcated security, and user protections. Do you guys know that if you use Wi-Fi at a coffee shop like a Panera, that Panera has and will continue to get sued for patent infringement? Not the router manufacturer that created the Wi-Fi router, but the coffee shop that's delivering the service to you. It's because there's a lack of end user protection right now in the patent system, which is insane.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting time for this whole conversation. Many of you in the tech space may not even realize that you're at risk, to be honest with you. Demand letters are going out to people who use copying machines or the Wi-Fi connector or whatever it might be. It's rather broad. As you pointed out, there's been an effort to come up with legislation. There's also been a couple of developments in the last couple of weeks. One is the Supreme Court recently issued a decision on sort of the validity of software patents generally. So getting to your first point, the patent quality. And then the second thing is that Congressman Terry in the House of Representatives is about to introduce a demand letter piece of legislation that mirrors something in the Senate that Senator McCaskill has done. It gives the FTC more authority, the Federal Trade Commission, to regulate demand letters and ask for greater transparency. Some of these letters are coming out, you don't know who's actually asking who's behind the claim, essentially. Is there concern that these two developments could in fact take some steam out of the broader reform effort?
It's certainly a concern. We're very happy that patents are continuing to be an issue. The majority of my members, as I mentioned, the majority of the companies that are dealing with patent trolls are small businesses, and not just in the tech sector. We're actually part of a coalition in DC called the Main Street Patent Coalition that is 22 trade associations, and we're the only technology association. It's the bankers and the credit unions and the hotels and restaurants, because they're receiving demand letters and being sued by patent trolls as well as end users. But as long as it stays on the table, it's good for everybody, as long as the issue continues to be of high profile. Demand letters are an important component of this, and we're thrilled that Chairman Terry continues to push this, though as we have said to him and will continue to say as this bill moves forward, it's like the dam is starting to leak, and if you only plug one hole, it just makes the water come out faster. If you raise the standard for demand letters without dealing with heightened pleading, you're just gonna get more lawsuits. You're gonna have fewer demand letters and more straight to lawsuits. And if you don't limit discovery costs, then you still have the hammer without any sort of carrot for, we're trying to change the formula that patent trolls use, change the economic decision they make when they arbitrage a broken system. And we need to find ways to increase their risk and lower their reward. It was an interesting fight this year in the House and in the Senate, where some patent-holding tech companies, some of the staples of America's technology economy, didn't want real, meaningful reform because they thought it would lower the value of their patent portfolio. I don't think that's what patents were for. Being able to monetize an idea is great. Being able to create a business around an idea is essential. But creating a portfolio and counting that among your assets as a company is not what this was intended by the patent system. And so when we look at this holistically, we have to change the behavior of the worst actors, these patent trolls who are choking off, I think that was $19 billion annually, choking off economic growth and killing startups while also doing real damage to companies like Rackspace and Microsoft and Google and Apple, these tech sort of stalwarts that are trying to grow the economy, trying to move forward, and they've built into the cost of doing business $50, $60, $100 million a year in litigation costs. That's insane.
One other area, just to kind of dive into a little bit, is the state attorneys general have all rallied around addressing this issue. There's been legislation passed at the state level. Is there anything notable or a pattern there that is useful as people from New York look at what's happening? What can they do to support that state level operation, and does that harm a federal approach?
I think the first notable thing about it is all the governing that really matters happens at the local level. That if we can, it's not going to hurt the federal approach. I think if anything, it will ultimately drive it over the edge. That if there is governors are pretty provincial about their economic numbers, and they'd like them to keep going up, and they know what patent trolls are. They know that they're a real threat to technological growth. And if they can provide a safeguard, they can bring in companies that are looking for some protection. I think there are 12 states now that have passed meaningful demand letter litigation reform. We were just talking about with Chairman Terry's bill. That's a sign of things to come. Obviously, patents are issued at a federal level, which makes it complicated to get into the quality issue at a state level. But in terms of litigation costs, in terms of pre-litigation reform, we can make meaningful strides on a state basis. It is not a mistake that 80% of patent troll cases happen in either East Texas or Delaware.
So I want to continue a little bit with this sort of theme of what's happening at the state and local level. So Chris, you mentioned you had been up in Massachusetts. Are there other plans to kind of get out there and be in the states and local jurisdictions to talk about cybersecurity in the framework?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So to answer your question, yeah. So the Boston event was great. We had Kevin Burns, who was the Commonwealth of Massachusetts CISO, give some opening remarks and participate in one of our panels, and it was fantastic and had some very good sort of observations that we don't necessarily get at the DHS level. And so that was kind of our trial balloon. We knew that we were going to do a number of different events. Sort of, we hope to do a number of different events across the country, and I think that sort of solidified it. So yeah, we're going to do some smaller kind of more focused sessions on particular industries. So we're still working through perhaps doing like a healthcare in the Atlanta area, maybe an energy or an oil, natural gas in the Houston area. There's I didn't know this, there's sort of a large defense industrial base in the Pittsburgh area. So we're going to try to do these sort of more focused ones. And then gearing up for, in the fall time frame, and we're we're still working through because everyone else and their grandmothers having conferences in the fall as well. So we're trying to find a good date, but looking on the West Coast, working with the DHS cybersecurity advisors to find a good location and group of folks, so it's a valuable session. So yeah, and then probably the capstone will be back in February, because in this past February the final NIST framework was released and our CQ program was stood up. So we're hoping to do kind of a capstone event in November, March timeframe in the DC area again. So.
This is a little off topic, but I'm looking at the audience, and I'm guessing some people here are in the startup community. And has there been any talk or attention to how to engage the startup community in some of this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So a little of it's been overcome by events, unfortunately, but yes, there's a decent. And let me caveat. So I'm glad to be part of this forum. I'm more of a national policy geek than a tech geek, unfortunately. So I don't maybe not use all the right words, but there's a bit of an incubator community in the Arlington, DC area, and so there has been some talk about are there ways that DHS can help the startups think about cybersecurity in general, but ways to leverage the framework or ways to leverage some of the other tools that are out there to make it available to a larger community and perhaps earn some revenue from that. So, yeah.
Dan, again, thinking a little bit about the startup world, when CompTIA first started to look at this issue, we were sort of fascinated with the Staple Act approach, right? And he started to talk about this, that we're educating a whole bunch of really smart engineers and others that are foreign born. Once they get their degree, off they go. And we're not keeping them here in the United States. And the idea of stapling a green card to their degree, it would keep them here, get that intellectual prowess going, create more jobs. But for the startup world, I also thought what was really interesting about that is some of them can't afford the H-1B visa fees and the process that one has to go through.
Yeah.
And that this was actually an opportunity for smaller companies and startups to actually compete for that intellectual property that some of these graduates bring. Have you guys looked at that particular issue at all? And how that works?
Well, and we've worked a lot with, actually in April, we held a series of events in 8 different cities across the country, starting in New York, going all the way to the West Coast and coming back to DC with different accelerators and incubators. And we heard from a lot of folks who were either running those incubator programs or who had started a company through one of those incubators, that they're spending a lot of their time, what do you want to be doing when you're starting a company? You want to spend all of your time thinking about how to grow the company, how to come up with a plan. Instead, they're dealing with legal fees. They're trying to figure out, am I going to be able to stay? It's taking up like half of their time in some cases, worrying about dealing with all of these different applications and the fees. And so it's not a good environment for trying to create a business. You shouldn't have to worry about whether or not you're going to get to stay here if you want to create a business here. And so as a result of that, a lot of folks that we talked to we were holding these events and incubators, were calling in through Google Chat because they were back in a country that they either came from or another country that they moved to, because it was easier for them to start a company there or to find the people that they needed to or whatever the issue was. So I think those folks are increasingly engaged in this issue, and I think it's really important. There's speaking to the state and local discussion, Governor Snyder from Michigan, who's a Republican, has been very good on this issue. He just created a state office for new Americans and has applied for Michigan to be only the second state to have an EB-5 center to try to attract foreign investors. Governor Deval Patrick in Massachusetts proposed something interesting called Global Entrepreneurs in Residence Program that would be sort of a work around the federal system that would allow some of these foreign students who are trained here in America to remain affiliated with public institutions or private institutions while they're growing their businesses in sort of, in waiting or hoping to get visas to stay. So I think there are different things that states are trying. There's actually a program here in New York City that's run by the New York City Economic Development Corporation, which helps place foreign-trained STEM folks in jobs that meet their area of expertise. So, the idea of maybe a taxi driver who has an engineering degree from India, who is clearly not meeting, his potential here. And there are folks that, you don't have to apply through the H-1B visa system, who are already here in the U.S. who have these skills. And so there's programs like that to sort of help place some of those folks in high-demand fields. So.
I mean, I think that's really instructive. I mean, you mentioned, I think July 9th, the U.S. Chamber is doing, in partnership with groups like yours, sort of a nationwide push for immigration reform. But today, sitting in the audience, you've just heard a number of ways where you could actually go out to your elected officials here in New York and say there are examples across the country to actually improve our posture with very well-trained individuals, keep them here and keep them working in ways that are productive for our industry. So that's great to hear. Jake, you can probably guess where I'm going with this. So thinking about sort of the state and local perspective, is there any advice that you would give on how to go out and address this issue of patent litigation reform?
We, this past year, 2013 and a little bit of 2014, we did patent summits across the country. We held 14 of them in all, where we would go to a city and host a panel like this and have a conversation with patent troll victim, patent attorney, and if we could find one, a patent troll. If they would come and talk to us. And actually, I mean, Intellectual Ventures participated in a lot of them, and they were great. And they are adamant in their defense of their industry. But it's at every one of those events, the audience, whether it was 50 people or in some cases 250 people, the impression that was left over at every event was, I wasn't scared before I got here. I just came to get some information and free beer. Now I'm terrified. And that happened everywhere we went. It was remarkable. And the thing that can be done, right, is to continue to champion reform, particularly from startups and from the technology community to the attorneys general and to the governor's offices, and to pay attention to this and to use organizations like the Alliance as a sounding board, because we'll find you, we'll find stories and turn them into meaningful action items in DC and on the state level. And this isn't over. I think we probably have another 15 or 16 months of negotiation and hammering out a bill, but it's gonna get done. And it's gonna be great when it does. It's gonna take a lot of pressure off a lot of people that didn't deserve it in the first place.
I want to open it up to questions from the audience. I don't know if you all want to pose a couple questions to the panelists here. Hopefully, maybe not.
It's a little off topic. The Supreme Court decision on Aereo, I think I'm saying it right?
Yeah.
TV about downloading television shows. What's your opinion on that ruling? And does it hurt consumers since everyone's cable bill is like $160 a month? Yet there's technology now that you can download, stream any kind of movie or TV based on Aereo's technology, and is going to put that small business out of business because of the ruling.
I have to confess, I have not looked at the whole of the decision. We were very focused on what the implications might be for cloud computing, and I understand that the decision was drawn narrowly enough so that it doesn't actually impinge on cloud computing, which is a core piece for our membership. But I don't know if anybody else wants to speak about Aereo.
I don't think any of us want to touch that.
Yeah.
Does it hurt consumers? Not necessarily. It slows. Technology can tend to get out over its skis a little bit, and we may have been there with this, that a lot of, you can't entirely change the economics of entertainment and production and copyright overnight just because the technology exists to be able to get it for free. That being said, this is being taped, isn't it? All right.
Get all my startup friends no longer pay Time Warner bills.
And that's
They're going ahead and doing it anyway, right?
and a lot of people are unplugging.
Right.
Is sort of the common term, and you can do it for a lot less money these days. There's no question about it. There's an old the joke in Washington D.C. of the National Association of Broadcasters thinks it's a bad idea. You should probably buy stock in it. That from television to cable television to VCRs to satellite radio to Slingbox and iTunes, I mean everything that they oppose is what we live by now, and it's because their job is to defend this block of technology that is essential to what we do. It's part of the modern communication system. It's the way that we engage with content. It's how we as a country literally learned how to sort of take in news and events. That doesn't mean it's not going to change. It just means it has to change iteratively, not utterly revolutionary. Maybe. I don't know.
Yes.
On the idea that Microsoft, is opening their Vancouver offices and the sort of the United States being a desirable place for businesses. How does the net neutrality debate sort of play into that whole atmosphere?
Let's see. So you guys are hitting all the good ones this morning. So I hadn't really thought of it with respect to immigration. I mean, net neutrality obviously is a very challenging issue to try and come up with the right balance to the market forces that Jake was just talking about. I'm not sure. Could you expound on your question a
Yeah,
little
sure.
bit? Yeah.
I mean, just sort of as a place for a company to set roots in the atmosphere that implications of neutrality or different forms of it could create for businesses when they're looking at creating someplace for their headquarters.
I don't know the answer to this question, which is
Yeah.
interesting. Do other countries have net neutrality doctrines in there? Canada doesn't, as far as I know.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the first place that my head went because of Vancouver. We might be the only country that has a net neutrality principles doctrine.
Europe too.
All of Europe
Most
does.
of Western nations.
Right, but
I mean, not China where they control the internet.
Right.
But the question
net
was
neutrality.
really, yeah.
Actually, and Europe has it as a EU principle,
Right.
but data localization practices going into place in Germany and Eastern Europe are going to stop that dead in its tracks. I mean, yes, we have free flow of data. You can't stop it, except at the German border is not actually a good way to.
It also cuts both
Sorry.
ways though, right? I mean, thinking about the different principles within net neutrality, right? The anti-blocking, transparency, but a lot of companies would argue that you need to have a market system as well. So it depends on, where you are on the scale of net neutrality and the principles that are behind it.
Yeah, and from a country-to-country basis, which is sort of what I was going for, that it's really interesting. That's a good question.
Yeah. That was a good start, actually. So, anybody else? Yeah.
On the subject of foreign investment, Mr. Wallace had mentioned 5, Michigan State being the second state. What was the first, and what's the typical size of these 85 regional centers?
I'm not actually sure on the size. Vermont was the other state that has this type of center, and so I think the reason that Michigan became one of the second states to do it, or became the second state to do it, I think Michigan and a lot of states and cities in the sort of Rust Belt region have experienced a lot of population decline, and so I think a lot of them are looking at strategies for how to attract foreign investment, but also just people to their states and to their cities, and so Detroit has a lot of strategies as well for trying to attract immigrants to Detroit. I think kind of what we're seeing is that things aren't moving at the federal level, and so what can states or cities do in the absence of federal action? And I think that there are some countries, actually Canada is a place where the system works sort of regionally, and so folks can be allocated based on like the needs of the economy for the region of Canada. And right now we don't have a system that allows us to do that, and so I think a lot of people are trying some of these sort of creative options. We'll see if it ends up working. But to try to attract people to their states, maybe from other places. A lot of folks also find that, this is true I think in Ohio, maybe Michigan as well, that a lot of the folks that come and study in their universities leave, or Americans, folks who are born in the United States, end up leaving the state after they study there, and that folks who come from other countries who study in their universities want to stay but aren't able to, and so that's another audience that, if only there were a way for those folks to stay, then it would be, a way to, grow population and support the economy in those states. So I think that's one example. I think there's lots of examples of different states and cities trying to do things to attract more people, immigrants being one category of folks.
And Dan, just for everybody's benefit, can you just describe the EB-5 program so everybody knows?
I don't have a lot of expertise in that.
So,
Uh,
I think the idea is that if there's a certain level of investment and commitment to stay,
Yeah.
that green cards accompany that.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Chris, you had mentioned that there's probably a couple more things going on nationwide that you could share with the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I was sitting here sort of listening to the great comments of my co-panelists here and some of the questions, and realized that I was even falling into the trap myself, which is, it sounds a little bit like we're sort of bashing the government and
Just
in some
Congress.
ways, yeah, just and in some ways, that's probably spot on. But in other ways, to do your earlier request, I mean, so again, our program tries to go out and talk to different folks because there is a state and local, and there's a regional and community level need to make sure that folks understand the importance of cybersecurity, but there's a national need as well. I mean, so that folks don't know when the next sort of heartbleed is, or when the next large breach is, where sensitive information is going to be, your credit card information is going to go after. So that's why we try to encourage not only at a state, local, regional level, but sort of a federal shout-out level any way that we can. So there's the Stop Think campaign that sort of tries to work to increase awareness on cybersecurity for a whole swath of different sort of communities. And then there's the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month in October that sort of bombarded you with commercials and whatnot. But so just wanted to reiterate that and from our perspective, there's we have two websites that if folks are interested in, or you may or may not have visited. There's the dhs.gov /C-cubed, CCBDVP, that has sort of description of our program, and then it has a link to the sort of more robust site that's on the US CERT, the US Computer Emergency Response Team. That has, and that's also uscert.gov /C-cubed, and that has a list of all the different tools, programs, capabilities, services, and things that are available to folks. So I guess my request is, if you have any questions, please feel free to visit any of those sites and/or send an email to our inbox, which again is ccubedvp@dhs.gov, and happy to answer any questions or coordinate.
And I was just going to say that even though we talk about the critical infrastructure, and that's the purpose of the plan, the framework, it has commercial benefit. I mean, if you undertake these practices, you're protecting your commercial information. So it goes beyond critical infrastructure. It's a set of best practices.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the most difficult, and thank you, that's sort of a lead into my second request. But I mean, that's one of our most difficult challenges, is trying to explain what is the return on investment. Why would I invest $1 in cybersecurity when I can invest it in litigating, legislative reform, or sort of helping my team? And so we're still working to try to explain. I mean, and it's difficult because if you're a part of a supply chain, you're part of the ecosystem, as we say, then your expenditure in cybersecurity sort of helps everyone as well as helps yourself. And in this day and age, we're seeing more and more the framework is becoming sort of a variable that folks are using, whether it's in terms of acquisition or whether in terms of contracting. You say, okay, we're looking at this firm, and they say they're using the framework. We're looking at this firm, and they haven't said about the framework. Then there may be a tendency to go with the firm that has that sort of those principles in place. So, but that was my second shot. So if folks have a way that, again, federal government said the Beltway, so we may not be. We found that as we go out to events like this and others, we're not telling folks what they want to hear, or they're not understanding us. So any advice or suggestions or things that we, DHS, can do better as we talk to owners and operators in terms of cybersecurity and why it's important, we'd love to take that feedback back.
I think we have time for one more question. There we go.
On Aereo, I'll just say that living in Brooklyn, I use Aereo to watch PBS, and I can't, since NTSC, I can't get it any other, ATSC, I can't get it any other way. But if you read the decision, if you read it, Scalia's dissent Judge Galli, is the one worth reading. And he says, it's a loophole and it's not the Supreme Court's business to to close loopholes. That's legislative, should be done by Congress. There's been a big bunch of response from Congress saying, yes, we've got to overhaul communications laws, chairs of committees. So I'm wondering, after the patent decision, has there been a similar outpouring of purpose from Congress that they should do something?
No. Short answer to that is no. There's more risk that it would stop them from feeling like they have to do something. It's a remarkable political formula that's being used right now, because there are groups that profit from patent trolls that aren't actually patent trolls. Litigation costs are higher, so lawyers get paid. And so the American Bar Association and trial lawyers, who are huge contributors to the Democratic Party, they don't want to see reform passed. And it is widely reported that the bill that was going to pass out of the Senate Judiciary Committee by a landslide and would have passed on the we got 66, 70 votes on the floor of the Senate, was killed by the majority leader because he didn't want to force Democrats to take a bad vote against trial lawyers in an election year. That's just politics, and that's not a moral reason to the moral imperative to make a law or to close a loophole. That's just politics, and there's really only two things that stop progress in DC, and it's money in politics, and this is both. So no, we have not seen that same response.
So on that note.
Yeah. Go vote.
Well, go vote. Also, just to wrap this up, there is a public-private partnership, and it does take all of us being engaged and asking for what we want and insisting that our process work as we want it to work. So if you take nothing away from this panel, it is that your engagement and involvement is important in terms of addressing these issues, in terms of being an educator to your peers, because you now know some things that you may not have known when you walked into this room. So that was the intent and purpose of TechVoice.
And I actually, you guys should all know that Senator Schumer was one of the leading advocates in the Senate, particularly for all forms of patent reform. You guys have a good one up here. Where it came off the rails was on other levels of Democrats.
And I think the best news of the morning is apparently the breakfast has
The food is here.
arrived. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists. I really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you, Erik.